Hi, Glenn.
Hi Nejmi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm looking forward to
Excellent.
today's conversation, where we're going to be looking at goal setting, and whether we're really measuring what matters when it comes to setting goals in our leadership. I think this one's particularly important because we are often looking at setting the vision, setting the direction, and looking at how we measure the impact or the outcome of what we're moving towards in leadership. And so I think a key impact that we're going to be looking to explore is actually how do we set goals that really drive results as leaders.
Yeah.
It's an important part of the kind of broader series. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that one.
Yeah, likewise. You and I were just saying off air before we started to record that I kind of personally see this as like the glue between the other two episodes in this series. You know, we looked at strategy and we've looked at personal goal settings, and I think this is kind of that's great. But how do you then be more certain of delivering the impacts and outcomes that you're looking for? And I think we're going to look at some tools that managers and leaders could be using and look at some pitfalls and some pros and cons of each, as well as sharing some of our own experiences, that will help make it more certain on the basis that it's never an absolute certainty that the results that you want are the results that you get, right? So, but one thing I can guarantee is that hoping for good results is not a strategy in itself that I would recommend.
Okay, all right. So de-risking, setting us a clearer strategy for how to drive towards outcomes with some degree of certainty. We acknowledge that that is a nigh on impossible task, to have to expect certainty around it. But putting in place structures that enable us to navigate forward with, again, some clarity, real purpose, hopefully real purpose, and again, certainty is where we're aiming for. So got it. With that set, I think it's useful to think about, well, what are the challenges around setting goals or navigating towards outcomes
Mm.
in a really impactful way in leadership.
Yeah, it's a really good initial question, I think, because I wonder whether one of the questions that doesn't get asked, and this is prompted by one of our colleagues, David, who does a lot of the research for us, has posed for us, which is actually, have we found ourselves at a place in organizations where goal setting has become just the way we do business? It's an expectation that we set some, it's an expectation that we have a plan, da 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 da. But actually, are we thoughtful enough about the goals that we're setting and the plans that we set in place to meet them? Or actually, do we ever sit back and go, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Why are we actually going through this process at all? Because I think one of the things that you and I would recognize, and I know you're going to share some of your sort of organizational experience too, but one of the things I think we both recognize is that very often organizations or leaders of teams and functions just set way too many goals. If you're setting, I don't know, 20 KPIs or 20 OKRs or what, it just seems way too many. And the danger is that none of them get done. So I think one of the takeaways from the session, this episode, I hope, is just reviewing the automaticity with which we tend to reach for goals when that might not be the right approach.
Yeah. Are we setting too many? And is that helpful? I think that it's a good challenge, right? Just coming back to the why that sits around it. If we're setting a vision or setting outcomes, KPIs, OKRs, whatever the language or the tooling is around setting these goals for our teams or for our function, or for the direction of travel for ourselves. Actually, why are we doing it that way, and is it purposeful? Like, is it going to help us to achieve the outcomes that we set out to achieve? Of course, I think it's clear to know that what gets measured can be managed. I think that's fair. So KPIs are an effective tool for helping us track whether we're performing and moving in the direction of travel against like operational goals or activities that we're responsible for. So that's helpful to a degree. But actually, if we are really thinking about what's going to help drive impact or drive change or changes of behavior, or help us to create an even bigger impact than we had over the past year or past quarter. Really thinking about why do we set goals in the rhythm that we do. Do people care about it? Do people actually care about what we're setting? And if not, what can we do to maybe a little bit differently to ensure that our team are fully bought into doing the activity that's actually going to drive change or drive outcomes in a bigger and bolder way than just the automatic way that sometimes we can fall into the trap. Sometimes we can fall into the trap.
Yeah, there's lots of good points in there. One of which, that more latter point around, if goals are dictated, how much buy-in are you likely to get? How much engagement do you get as a leader? That feels quite an old-fashioned way of, engaging with the whole goal-setting process. And somebody that you and I know a little bit, Professor Gary Latham, talks about setting goals that are participatory. So actually that you're engaging people in the goal setting together. So if you're a leader, you're likely to get, according to his research, higher bars set when those goals are set together. If an individual's allowed to set them for themselves, often they don't set the bar quite so high. But when it's set as a team, often those are set higher. So I think that's it's even that sort of idea. Why am I setting them as the leader? Could I do this differently in order to get greater engagement and greater likelihood of success? Is a question I wonder how many leaders ask themselves very often. Yeah.
I've seen it happen in both ways, right? Like I've seen it set down in the traditional top-down mechanism or mechanisms. I've seen it done in a more of a sort of democratic sort of buy-in setting. I have to admit, I'm much more of a fan of the second. Not to say that goals, team goals or organizational goals can only work when everybody has sat down and contributed towards crafting that out. I think it's possible to achieve it in somewhere in the middle and a bit of a hybrid. But actually, when you do people get an opportunity to share their input around direction of travel, lessons learned, getting a broader perspective around like how we are actually performing as a unit or as a function or as a team, and are able to contribute towards ideas around how we can navigate forward. It just, in my experience, that is far more likely to generate the right results, because it often holds up a mirror around, well, what are we tracking? Are the things that we're tracking, or the things that we're setting out towards, are they the right things? Are they actually going to help us to deliver the impact that we want to have, or not? Often, sometimes they can fall into the mechanical, like we track this because we think it's an important thing to track, but are we actually challenging, coming back to challenge the why that sits around it, and actually encouraging more of an opportunity for that healthy challenge to be discussed? I found is far more of a useful exercise to contribute towards that kind of goal setting purpose, if you want to have the impact as well. Because actually sometimes KPIs can hold you back. I think, like, especially if people, if we think about it, we've set these KPIs. Some people are tracking towards it in exceeding it. Some people are under cooking it. We spend regular, like, weekly time discussing the same things that we know help to drive operational rigor. And yet over time we're coming back and having the same conversations on a weekly basis. Like, all of the time and energy that's put into having those very repetitive conversations, and ultimately, if it's not driving impact or change in behaviors, I think it's more of a worthwhile conversation to come back to looking at, like, why is that not happening? Is there maybe a different conversation that we need to have in order to get people really driving towards the things that we think matter? Is there something?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You've made me reflect on a couple of shortfalls, I guess, or ineffective ways of monitoring goals that I think happen a lot. One is that we don't monitor them at all, or we start monitoring them early and then that fades away. So, they're very, I would be the first to admit that I'm a starter, not necessarily a completer finisher, in the sense that I get energy from starting a project, setting the goals, setting the vision, love all that. When that's kind of converted more to a kind of BAU type activity, I'll kind of assume it's moving on rather than necessarily check in with it. It depends on the realm, of course, but that would be a generalization of the way that I tend to do things. And then, 6 months later, you're thinking, whatever happened to that goal that that I'd set, and it hasn't moved forward as much, or actually it may well have moved forward, but I'm just not as close to it as I could be. So I do think that I see that a lot in organizations with leaders who've got a similar kind of mindset, which is they like to kick things off, love the energy from that, but actually don't monitor, to your point, over the long term. And the second point is just not being judgmental enough, and I mean that in a kind of assessing how things are moving, and then being critical, again, not in a negative way, but critiquing the progress or critiquing the goal and just going, it's no longer fit for purpose. Let's not just slavishly drive on, at this goal just because we said we have. If it's no longer fit for purpose, we should amend it, move on. There are two really common errors around the monitoring piece.
Yeah, I like. So, should we talk a little bit about a couple of different tools that we tend to, the kind of language that we tend to use when we're talking about goals in an organisational setting? There's a couple that are quite common. I'd say KPIs we've already addressed. We've talked a little bit about those. I think those are.
Let me just interrupt you a little bit because I think I just want to make sure that the audience, who might be in quite different sectors, quite different industries maybe, but also may have a range of experiences as leaders and managers. If we talk about KPIs, does everybody really know what a KPI is? So I'm just wondering whether we might quickly take a 10 seconds time out to go, KPI stands for, and when do we tend to use them? So KPI is key performance indicators, and it's language that you'll hear quite often around an organisation if that's the methodology that your organisation has chosen to use. I know you've had some experience working with KPIs. Do you want to kind of share a little bit about what they are and then lead into the point you were going to make?
Yeah, so KPIs, typically these are effective for tracking like performance over time. So they also tend to be measures of outcomes. So, if we are doing all of the things that we are responsible for doing as a team, then KPI X gets hit. So usually that's a good effective measure of, I like to think of them typically as you can have quantity metrics, which is more about are we doing enough, a volume of the tasks that are required to deliver the outcomes that we expect, and quality metrics too, are we doing them well enough to drive greater performance over time. So it tends to be about measures of outcomes and things that we are comfortable with knowing, how that's measured. So don't typically account for they're more about what has been done or what we're driving towards. Don't typically account for how we go about delivering those outcomes. So not so effective for managing some of the softer. I say softer. I actually don't like that description as softer.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah.
When I say softer, things like behaviors, the culture that exists within the team. When we talk about how we go about doing our business, they're often not so effective for sort of tracking or monitoring that. Do you feel that covers KPIs? To add on that?
Yeah, really good. And I would echo your I wouldn't say you didn't use the word loathing, but let me use it in relation to sort of hard and soft skills. And I think it's a really important point at this juncture to say, organizations can fall into goals being only revenue, turnover, profit, and they're all really important. But what are the things that contribute to those outcomes? And I'm not saying they shouldn't be there. That's what a business is about, right? Creating profit for shareholders. But it's not the only thing. And often you need to measure the elements that will help you reach those outcomes ultimately. But yeah, I think you've done a great job of KPIs. The other one, another 3-letter one, and I don't know if you'd agree, but I think it's a bit of if I was the marketing advisor to whoever came up, was it John Doerr who came up with the idea of OKRs, objectives and key results? I might have put a marketing head on and tried to come up with a different term. These are similar but different. Is that a fair enough way of sort of describing OKRs? They have some of the elements of KPIs, but they tend to find themselves being used in slightly different contexts, organizations with slightly different agendas.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So OKRs, in my experience, are a slightly more modern take on how we measure, objectives or direction of travel, rather, within an organization or a team. And so it's just been adopted far more regularly. You tend to find them in like tech, scale ups, like slightly newer organizations, and for a good reason. So objectives and key results is really about, or OKRs is really about how we change. So how we focus on like driving difference from here to, as we navigate forward, which is distinct from KPIs in terms of it shouldn't be, sometimes this can get mistaken. It shouldn't be about tracking operational, like, are we doing are we doing what we expect to do today? And what I mean by that is, operational output. Really, OKRs should be about driving change, transformation, changes in behaviors. So examples around that might be, aiming an objective to be, the most user-friendly, tech in topic X or whatever, or the highest rated in terms of customer experience or customer service. Setting out an objective and aim for where you want to be, and then having a key result that is a measurable, outcome that tells you that you're on the path towards that objective. So often I think this can be sort of misused a little bit in terms of some of those operational KPI-like activities can find themselves moving into the key results space of where the OKRs have been set, which the challenge around that is kind of not using OKRs in the way in which it is intended to be used, right? I think it can be, and sometimes you find yourself caught in between, with a bit of a hodgepodge of like, here's some of the new stuff that we want to aim towards, which might require, a very different approach, different spaces to reflect and build the muscle around how we navigate towards those more ambitious targets or the new, versus some of the operational, this is stuff that we just need to make sure we're on top of and managing, but there's not much newness in how we go about getting there, that we can find ourselves sometimes stuck in the middle of like having a wish list of everything in the OKR set, which is not really how it's intended to be organized. I think the pitfall around that comes back again to the point that you mentioned earlier, Glenn, around if we measure everything, we're also kind of measuring nothing. If everything's the priority, nothing's the priority.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. The thing that I like about OKRs, and it's linked to your last point around the measurement of these goals, is they're actually pretty rigorous around how you measure them, basically on a RAG system, red, amber, green. If you've fully completed something, then it gets green. I think it's something like I'll have to check we can add this to the show notes. It's something like somewhere between 70 and 85% there, then you can give yourself an amber, and if you're less than that, you give yourself a red. And so therefore you've got a really nice dashboard type approach where you can quickly see how you're doing against the OKRs that you've set. And actually what I like even more than that in some respects is you're not expected to achieve them all. It's about, as you said, driving change rather than necessarily the end point.
Yeah.
And as long as you can sort of show that you've moved, I actually really like that flexibility. And I don't mean that as an out or a get out of jail free card. It's just recognizing that, movement is often enough for you then to reassess whether it's still the right goal or not. and I think that's again not suggesting that we should flip flop between goals and things as a get out of jail card, but it's very much about recognizing sometimes when you started the world looked like this, and 6 months later it looks like this, and that's fine. I really like the monitoring element of OKRs, I have to say, and we've used them inside Exigence for I would say 5 or 6 years, on and off.
Yeah, I really like what you're just describing. Like OKRs are meant to be stretch, right? And actually, there's an acknowledgement that in changing a behavior or moving towards a newness, sometimes it's not linear, right? Like it won't be it's not as and not as predictable about like in 3 months' time we're going to be here, because there's all kinds of challenges that are inherent in getting there. So I think there's something nice about acknowledging that, navigating that change might be difficult, and it's not from a position of setting it out, but because often the bar can be very high, but actually the impact of having a high bar that is like moving into newer territory can be very motivating for a team to move towards. I think it's probably worth acknowledging that setting goals, whether they're KPIs or OKRs, in order to set them, in order for them to be effective, it's really important that they are motivating, that it taps into some, idea of what is motivating for your people, for your team, for yourself as well. And so it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that, setting goals effectively means setting goals that people are motivated to achieve. So if the stretch is too far and it's not, and it's unrealistic, that can have a demotivating factor associated to it too.
Yeah, and I think we've reached a really interesting point where we can bring all of these tools. We've got a couple more to talk about, but these tools together around the setting of the goal itself, along with then these as mechanisms for tracking them and setting out the plan. Is how big should the goal be? And you hear varying sort of pieces of research around that, and it depends whether you come from neuroscience as a background, or whether you come from psychology as a background, or maybe even some of the social sciences as a background. But to your point, I think stretch is really important. It's, for many people, it's really engaging to have a stretching goal. For many, they will just kind of throw their hands up and say, but I think the stretch has got to be sufficient enough that people feel it's worth, giving that extra effort for, but not so vast that you look at it and you go, there's no chance, so I'm not even going to start. And I heard a really interesting piece of research from Andrew Huberman on the Huberman Lab podcast. He was talking about goals and this idea that the most recent research around how big the stretch should be is that you should fail approximately 15% of the time. Now, he acknowledges that it's very difficult to set up a 15% threshold before you've even started, but so you recognize that. But if you could look at it and go, I think we've got an 85% chance of making this goal, that's probably enough of a margin to be stretch, if that makes sense, which I thought was really interesting. And maybe even more helpful for listeners is this well-trodden idea of, and this broadly accepted idea of small wins actually isn't very effective either. So, setting up lots of easy knockdowns, low-hanging fruit, call it whatever you like, actually is not very motivating in the long term either. So for your point, it doesn't require much of me, so I don't even have to get out of first gear. So I think that when we're setting goals, whether it's through KPIs or whether it's like OKRs or any other way of setting them, the degree of stretch is really important. And at some point, I'm sure we'll mention Csikszentmihalyi's idea of, working in flow, and that a sufficient stretch helps people work in that state of flow. When time seems to whiz by, you're having to really give your total focus and attention to it. I think there's some really interesting mechanisms, around how to engage people in whichever tool you use, to be more certain about the outcome.
Yeah. Let's explore that. There's something in what you just said as actually that really resonated with me with the low-hanging fruit stuff. Often I think that can be a distraction. Like if I would have, here's the quarter, here are the 15 things that me and my team need to achieve, then the easiest three are probably the things that I'll like commit some time or energy into making sure that's in the bag.
Yeah.
But they're not the most important. And so if you're prioritizing that ease over importance, that's a distraction in my opinion. Actually, it should be, we're going to spend, most of our resource, most of our thinking, our creativity around how to deal with the most important or impactful stuff. It's probably going to be the harder stuff. So it's just maybe that's a watch out or a pitfall. That if you're like setting those things up so that it is motivating for the team, actually sometimes I think that can pose a distraction. So
yeah, I agree. I think it's based on the idea that you get some momentum by some small wins early, right? That's my understanding of where that's kind of emerged from. To your point, I think the problem is actually what you do is you it's almost like spinning your wheels because it's so easy. You don't really get any traction. Whereas tackling, as you said, Nejmi, those more important elements, yeah, it's harder, but you've got traction and it's valuable and it'll add value to other things. And so I think it's a falsehood to just tick off the easy stuff. And let's just come back to right at the start of the episode. Why is any of this important? Well, as a leader and manager, you will be judged on outcomes. Nobody, let's be honest, your boss is not going to be that bothered if all you're doing is tick off the easy stuff. They're going to look at the big rocks you've managed to move, right? Not the little pebbles.
Yeah. So how to focus on setting goals that people care about, like how to move the big rocks.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's worth having a look at maybe a couple of other tools that either seem to have had their time or are less common inside organizations. I want to ask you about one specifically because I know you have a tech background yourself. Balanced Scorecard, I think, was a really nice idea, early 2000s-ish, I think, but that's certainly when I started to hear about it. And this idea of helping organizations set goals in a 4-box quadrant, 2x2 sort of model, where instead of in addition to having financial goals, as we've already said, really important for the health and the longevity of an organization, they were also added in other boxes to help broaden the focus a bit and make sure that other elements were inside or in sight rather as part of the goal setting. So that's, I don't know if you've come across balanced scorecards. I've certainly worked in an organization where it was quite the thing.
We used to use that a lot in consulting. Which I think was appropriate in that setting because most of the talent in the team, the majority of their time would be spent externally, like serving clients, and so the remaining resource that was available within the team, anybody that was on the bench or wasn't chargeable for a period of time, would focus on the internal imperatives for the team. And so the internal imperatives would be across that balanced scorecard. Yes, chargeability or the economic measures were there, but also what we were doing as a collective to build like thought leadership or some more positioning in the market, like developing new capabilities, all of these things. That would be what the focus of the balanced scorecard. So it's nice to give a rounded focus for the team if there are multiple dimensions to focus on.
Yeah. And they typically are, the other 3 boxes are typically, but I think you can manipulate a little bit to suit your organization, right? But they're typically customer, process and systems, and then people. Right. So I think there's the danger for me with the model is that you end up feeling you have to fill all the boxes. And back to your point that you so eloquently pointed out right at the beginning, if you're trying to do everything, you end up doing nothing, or you can't focus on everything. I think the danger is with a 4-box model is you end up with even 3 goals in each would be a lot. 12 goals, that's a lot. There's a lot. So I like it for its broader focus bit, but I think there are some traps around it. And I don't see organizations I don't hear when we go and visit clients, them using that quite as much as they did do 10 years ago, let's say.
No, I haven't seen it for a while.
No. And are you familiar with this one that was new to me, this idea of the North Star metric? Only the label was new to me. I get the idea, but is that something that you're familiar with?
Yeah, familiar with North Star. So interestingly enough, in the like strongest example that I have of both North Star and OKRs, they would both be together. So
Right.
we've got our North Star metric and then all of the other OKRs, which ideally should contribute towards the North Star metric, but sometimes are 2 or 3 degrees separated. So it wasn't always clear what the link was. And inevitably, when you've like expressed this is our so North Star metric is the one guiding metric that we're driving towards that demonstrates that we're moving towards our longer term ambition, strategy, and the purpose for the organization. It just is the most important priority. But then the signal that can send to the rest of the team is it if that's the North Star, what are the other priorities and what's the relationship between those? Because what you don't want to do is lose the room around saying, all of these things are important because that's what I've agreed with the more senior, like broader stakeholders, like upwards within the organization. These are all the things that we're going to do. But this one's more important. These are less important, but these are just as important as that one. It's a very complicating message to be sending. So I have seen that. I also know that can bring with it its own complexity or its own challenge, even in the simplicity of just like this is the North Star metric.
Yeah. There's something quite galvanizing about it. Back to your point from earlier on, if it is almost the culture of it defines the culture of the organization, or rather the purpose of the organization. I mean, at Exigence, for example, I would say, although I haven't used this language, with our team, is that our North Star metric is that we want to help at least 2,000 new leaders every year. So unique leaders, i.e. we're not double counting leaders across years if they happen to be in projects with us over that time. And I think that, to people in our space is really quite engaging. And that's okay. We could do that very easily and lose a shed load of money because you could run lots of free programs. So I think you have to be careful, don't you, about how you might describe a North Star metric, unique leaders that we've helped in a year per year, alongside just the very things that are going to keep the business going, right? So there's very rare, isn't it? I think one of the things that's come out of this conversation for me is it's rare that a goal sits in isolation of everything else. Even that North Star doesn't sit in isolation of it because there's lots of things that need to happen in order for that to be met. So I think busy leaders, the danger that you could do is you could just plump for a particular goal and not consider it in the context of everything else, and then you end up getting lack of focus maybe, or even you've got one goal over here that's contradicting something that's been set over here. So it requires a bit of that 360 type thinking, I think.
I totally agree. I think that's why what I alluded to earlier, that I think around this kind of democratizing idea, I think that's why it's so critical to make sure that the goals that are set in alignment with that there's alignment, like up alongside and downward across where the team sits within the organization, to ensure that it is aligned with like a North Star or overarching strategy, but also that it makes sense to everybody within the team as to like what it is and why that's the focus and how that's going to contribute towards impact and success, and that everybody believes in that it's a good idea. Because often goals can or plans even can lose, can fail at the first hurdle when we're not able to really communicate or commit our team individuals to why that is going to be our focus and why it's important that people connect with it, why people care about it, why this is the thing that we are going to really commit all of our time, our energy into achieving, or the things. Because often, if we don't do that work as leaders to make sure that we've really galvanized, those around us or those that we're reliant on committing to delivering those outcomes, if we haven't got people to buy into those, the direction of travel and how we're going to get there and why, and we haven't spent that time making sure that everybody is brought along on that journey too, it's going to be really difficult to achieve the outcome. And ultimately, that's our currency, right? Like
Yeah.
as leaders, the impacts that we're able to deliver through our people is how we're measured.
Okay, that leads me to a really interesting question. It may not be interesting for you or for listeners, but it's really interesting for me. So I'm going to take a selfish moment, if I like, and ask you this, linked to your last point. When, as a leader, do you know that enough's enough? And the reason I say that is because very often you'll hear advice, or if only you'd have just gone over that next hill, or just round the next corner, or and actually, that's not true. Because you should have quit this 3 months ago. And so when and I genuinely find that a real challenge. So I'm actually asking for your help here, because I think there are times when I've been really uncertain. Do I just double down and get over the next hill, because that will get me either to or much, much closer to the outcome that I'm looking for? Or actually, am I just wasting energy when I should be pivoting and doing something else? Well, what's your sort of your understanding of that?
I mean, my head goes to some of my experience around, like, I guess, strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurialism. So that's the kind of space that I'm kind of borrowing some of this thinking from, around this idea of like ruthless validation. I think the answer to the challenge that you just shared there, Glenn, is in being really clear around what you're testing when you're moving things forward, when you're like committing your energy to moving things forward, being really clear about what are the key questions or the hypotheses that I'm testing here, so that you've effectively you're setting yourself like a series of like small test experiments, and that based on what comes back, that's going to inform whether we go ahead, whether we continue or we don't. And so even in setting your goals, also being really clear about, well, how will I know, as you go along the way, how will I know that this is the right thing? Like, what are the measures of success on the journey towards achieving said OKR or whatever North Star metric? What are the tests that I need to explore? And going through that kind of like ruthless validation is what I call it.
I love that. Yeah, is that borrowed from sprint methodology? There's some language that you've used there which sounds quite similar to the sort of sprint idea.
Yeah, exactly. It's like fail fast. If you're going to fail on setting towards something, that you don't waste too much time pursuing it, right? Like if you know what the measures of what the tests are, what the measures of success are as you navigate towards it, and therefore where the pivot points lie. But also getting using the team around you to verify, like, are we committed? Do we feel like this is the right direction to travel, or do we need to look at this in a slightly different way? Encouraging space to do that work on the goal with the team, I think is also really useful.
That's what comes great distinction, by the way. No, thank you. That was really that's a really solid advice. I will be mindful of that, because I do find myself at those points sometimes, and I think it's probably because I know what the goal is, but I'm probably not clear on, in this period, what we're testing, and that will be a kind of go no go moment potentially. Well, a little phrase, I don't know if it was rehearsed or whether you've read it somewhere, or indeed, as is much more likely knowing you've just come up with it on the spur of the moment. That idea, we've made that distinction before about the work you're working on a team versus doing the work of the team. I think you just made a really lovely distinction there for me, which we should build on. I think, which not today necessarily, but at another time, is: are you doing the work of the goal, i.e. the work to achieve the goal, or are you actually spending some time working on the goal? Making it clearer, making it more rigorous, making it, checking that it's the right thing. I think there's a really nice distinction there, and I would lay money on lots of leaders and managers spending time working on the work of the goal, not spending maybe enough time even in the setting up of that goal originally. And we really spent some time to getting super clear and being sure this is the goal that we're chasing after.
Well, what a lovely challenge to set our dear listeners at this stage, right? Like if you are wrestling with, or if you're navigating, if you have a set of goals or ambitions within your in front of you, actually, creating spaces to do that work, to kind of verify is this the right thing? How do we know that we're like moving towards it? And are the team committed to it? Are there other ways of looking at this, achieving a similar outcome but navigating in a slightly different way? Doing that work on the goal, setting yourself regular time to do that, to check in on that and see how you're navigating forward. I think is a useful challenge to set down.
Surely better to invest that time before you start, and have more chance that the goal's the right one, more clearly stated, etc., than dive into things and then find that actually you should have invested a bit more time up front to give you a more robust goal with more chance of success. Yeah, really cool. Love that. Look, well, I think we've probably come to the end of our allotted time. There's a lot there, and we could have talked about other tools, for measuring progress against things like engagement surveys and 360s and all those kind of things, which we'll have to save for another time. But I'm hoping that what we've given to listeners here is a very clear idea of the importance of what I would call the glue. It's not quite right, but it's the mechanisms that you're putting in place to give you more chance of delivering, a successful strategy or a successful plan and reaching the goals that you've set out or you've been given to achieve. And I think that these tools, picking the right one for the right moment, is something that I'll definitely take away. And again, I think that's certainly an impact we want to have left people with. Is it doesn't really matter which tool you use, to try and making the right choice for the right context is important. And you don't have to use any of the ones we've talked about, but I do think setting a goal, investing, as you rightly said, early, and investing deeply in time on the goal, make sure it's stretching enough, well communicated, would definitely be takeaways for me. Anything that you've kind of taken away, particularly, Nejmi, as a thought?
I love the idea of thinking about goals, not just in that isolation, right? That actually, I do like the glue analogy actually. In linking what the direction of travel for the organisation to the direction of travel for those that are within your, that underneath your leadership, doing the work to really make sure that is cohesive, that it does stick together, so it's set up for success, that you can, test it and iterate it as needed in order to deliver the impact. I really like that as an idea, and also that this is a bridge in the topics that we've explored, or that we're exploring in this season. Is it worth talking a little bit about the masterclass?
I think definitely we'll put all the details into the show notes, but as we've set out this podcast, one of the things we said we want to try and do is really interact and continue to offer some value to the audience, but in a way that was perhaps a bit different from how other podcasts have done it. So at the end of every season, so that's after every 3 episodes, we're going to run a 90-minute roundtable conversation for you to come to join in and to really do some work on the topics. So you can bring questions that you've got. We'll share a little bit more input, but really it's an opportunity for you to work with other leaders, maybe from other sectors, and really work on some of the areas that you feel that it would be useful and valuable for you to have a bit more thinking time on. So that will be in March, and we'll post all the details, including the link as that becomes available. It's not quite available yet when we've recorded this, at least, but we'll have that in the show notes so that people can access it and sign up early. As much as we would like to have, thousands of leaders on the call, I think initially we're going to limit the number, but so do sign up early once that link becomes live.
Yeah, brilliant. Another opportunity to amplify your impact, amplify the impact from these conversations and others. So very much looking forward to that. Thank you, Glenn.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Nejmi. Until next time, sir. Look after yourself.
Likewise. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.